The desert wind carried ash instead of sand that morning. Captain Sarah Mercer pressed her palm against the clay wall of the outpost, feeling the tremor before she heard it. A low vibration that crawled up through the earth like something hungry. She'd been in conflict zones for 8 years, long enough to know the difference between artillery fire and something closer. Something worse. This was closer. The village of Al-Rashid sat in a valley cupped by ancient hills, its mud brick houses the same color as the dirt roads that wound between them. From above it probably looked like nothing, just another cluster of structures bleeding into the landscape. But Sarah knew better. She knew the bakery where old men gathered at dawn. She knew the school with its broken windows patched with cardboard. She knew the faces of children who'd learned to play silently, their games muted by the constant drone of uncertainty overhead. And she knew Rex. The Belgian Malinois sat beside her now, his ears swiveling independently like radar dishes. His coat was the color of burnt caramel, darker along his spine where the sun hadn't bleached it. He was 5 years old, trained in explosives detection, handler protection and search and rescue. On paper, he was military equipment. In reality, he was the only thing in this godforsaken place that made sense to her anymore. Rex's head tilted slightly to the left. Sarah followed his gaze but saw nothing, just the empty street, a plastic bag tumbling past, the same crumbling walls she'd memorized weeks ago. But Rex's body had gone rigid, every muscle locked into that particular stillness that came before action. "What is it, boy?" He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something she couldn't see, tracking movement in air that looked empty. The fur along his spine lifted slowly, one hair at a time, as if something invisible were drawing a finger down his back. Sarah's hand moved to her sidearm without conscious thought. The vibration came again, stronger this time. Somewhere in the village, a door slammed. A woman's voice called out in Arabic, sharp with concern. Then silence, the kind that felt like holding your breath underwater, waiting to see if you'd make it to the surface. Rex whined, low and deep in his chest. It was a sound Sarah had never heard him make before. Wisudase canned 3 hours earlier. The morning had been almost normal. Sarah had watched the sunrise from the rooftop of their temporary command post, a former municipal building with walls pockmarked by bullet holes from a conflict no one here wanted to name. The sky had turned from black to purple, to that particular shade of gold that existed nowhere else on Earth, the kind of light that made you forget, just for a moment, that everything around you was broken. Rex had been chasing a lizard. It should have been funny. A highly trained military working dog reduced to puppy-like excitement by a tiny reptile darting between rocks. But Sarah had learned to read him the way some people read weather patterns, and even then, even during that brief moment of play, something had been off. His movements were too quick, too jerky. His attention kept fragmenting, pulled away by things she couldn't perceive. The village had been waking up slowly. Smoke from cooking fires twisted into the pale sky. A rooster crowed with mechanical persistence, apparently unaware that roosters in war zones were supposed to have learned discretion by now. Sarah had heard the shuffle of feet, the murmur of voices, the everyday sounds of survival that continued regardless of whatever horrors had come before or might come next. She'd been filing her daily report when Corporal Jenkins burst through the doorway. "Ma'am, we've got civilians incoming." "Family of 4. They're saying something about needing to cross to the medical station, but they're not on the approved movement list." Sarah had looked up from her laptop, already tired. "Tell them, Ma'am," Jenkins's voice dropped. "One of them's a kid. Little girl, she's not in good shape." That was how Amira entered her life. The girl was maybe 7 years old, rail thin, with enormous dark eyes that seemed to take up half her face. She wore a pink dress that had once been bright, but was now faded to the color of old rose petals, torn at the hem and patched inexpertly with fabric that didn't match. Her right arm was bandaged with strips of cloth that had soaked through with something dark and rust-colored. Her parents stood behind her, a father with worry carved deep into the lines around his mouth, a mother clutching a sleeping infant. They were speaking rapidly in Arabic, gesturing, their desperation making the words tumble over each other. Sarah's translator, Fadi, listened intently, then turned to her. "They say she was hurt 2 days ago. A piece of they don't know what, metal. It was just lying in the street and she picked it up to move it out of the way, and it cut her deeply. The wound is infected. They need antibiotics, but the clinic in the village has nothing left." Sarah knelt down to Amira's level. The girl didn't meet her eyes, staring instead at a point somewhere past Sarah's shoulder. Her lips were slightly parted. her breathing shallow and too quick. "Tell them we'll help," Sarah said, keeping her voice gentle. "Fadi, get the medic and—" Rex had pushed past Jenkins, moving directly to Amira. The girl's eyes went wide. She took a step back, nearly stumbling over her mother's feet. But Rex sat down immediately, making himself smaller, and did something Sarah had never seen him do on duty. He whined softly and lowered his head, pressing his nose to the ground in front of the girl, in what could only be described as a gesture of submission. Of comfort. Amira's hand lifted slowly, trembling, and touched the top of Rex's head. The dog remained perfectly still, letting her fingers trace the lines of his skull, tangle gently in the fur of his ears. His tail gave one careful wag, and for just a moment the girl's face softened into something that might have been the ghost of a smile. But then her eyes went distant again, focusing on nothing. And Rex's body went rigid in that way Sarah was beginning to recognize as a warning she didn't yet understand. Tariq Amsinov, the medic, had cleaned and rebandaged Amira's wound, administered antibiotics, and cleared the family to move to the medical station 2 kilometers east. Sarah had filed the necessary paperwork, updated the movement log, and returned to the endless task of maintaining security in a place where security was a fiction everyone agreed to pretend was real. But Rex wouldn't settle. He paced the command post in tight circles, pausing at the door at the windows, returning to Sarah, and pressing his nose against her leg with unusual insistence. When she tried to give him commands, sit, stay down, he obeyed with mechanical precision, but immediately resumed his restless movement the moment she released him. "What's wrong with the dog?" Jenkins asked, watching Rex with the wary expression of someone who'd grown up afraid of large animals and never quite gotten over it. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. She'd checked him for injuries, examined his paws for thorns or cuts, offered him water and food. He'd refused everything. His focus was absolute and completely opaque to her, as if he were listening to a frequency she couldn't hear, watching a channel her eyes couldn't access. At 1400 hours, the explosion came. It wasn't close, maybe 3 kilometers west on the far side of the village, but the sound rolled across the valley like thunder, and Sarah felt it in her chest, that concussive pressure that made your heart forget how to beat for just a moment. Black smoke began to rise in a column that the wind caught and pulled apart into ragged streamers. The radio crackled to life immediately. Multiple voices talking over each other, unit designations, coordinates, casualty reports pouring in before anyone could have possibly assessed the situation. Sarah was already moving, grabbing her gear, calling for her squad to mobilize. Rex was at the door before she was, body coiled tight, ready. But as they prepared to move out, the dog did something unexpected. He turned and ran in the opposite direction, not toward the explosion, not toward the smoke and chaos and the place where help was obviously needed. He ran east, toward the road the family had taken, toward the medical station, his paws throwing up small clouds of dust as he accelerated into a full sprint. Rex heel! He didn't even slow down. Sarah's heart was pounding now, adrenaline and confusion mixing into something that tasted like metal. Dogs didn't disobey. Not dogs like Rex. Not without reason. She made a split-second decision that would either save lives or end her career. "Jenkins, take command of the response team. Coordinate with Lieutenant Morrison. I'm going after the dog." "Ma'am, you can't—" But she was already running, following the trail of dust that marked Rex's trajectory, her boots pounding the packed earth, her weapon secure against her chest. Behind her, Jenkins was shouting something into the radio. But the words dissolved into noise, meaningless against the clarity of her singular focus. Rex was trying to tell her something. She'd spent 3 years learning his signals, his body language, the subtle differences between alert and aggression, between detection and distraction. And this was none of those things. This was pure instinct, the kind of ancient knowing that predated training, that bypassed the careful conditioning of military protocols and went straight to something deeper. Something was wrong. Not at the explosion site, somewhere else. Somewhere Rex was running toward with the kind of desperate speed that meant time was already running out. Sarah's lungs burned as she ran, the weight of her gear dragging at her shoulders, sweat stinging her eyes. The road stretched ahead, empty except for the shrinking form of Rex in the distance, and the silence that had settled over the village after the explosion felt wrong, too complete, too sudden, as if the world were holding its breath, as if it knew something terrible was about to happen. Rex was a quarter-kilometer ahead when Sarah saw him stop abruptly, his body going low and tense. She pushed harder, her legs screaming protest, and closed the distance until she could see what had frozen him in place. The road forked here, one branch leading to the medical station, the other curving back toward a cluster of houses that sat at the base of the northern hills. And there at the junction was the family. But they hadn't continued toward the medical station. They were standing still, the father turned back toward the village, the mother clutching the infant tighter, Amira between them with her head tilted at an odd angle, as if listening to something Sarah couldn't hear. Their body language was all wrong, not the purposeful movement of people walking somewhere, but the frozen uncertainty of people who'd just realized they were lost or trapped. Sarah slowed to a tactical approach, her hand moving to her weapon out of pure instinct. Rex was ahead of her, creeping forward in a low crouch, his attention fixed not on the family but on the ground around them. His nose was working overtime, pulling in air in sharp bursts, processing information Sarah couldn't begin to access. "Fadi," she called into her radio. "I need a translator at coordinates," Rex barked. One sharp, piercing sound that cut through the air like a blade. The father turned, saw Sarah, and his face collapsed into an expression of relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. He started to move toward her, his mouth opening to speak. "Stop!" Sarah's voice came out harder than she intended, her hand raised. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong, and she didn't know what it was, but Rex knew, and if Rex was telling her to be careful, then she was going to be fucking careful. The father froze mid-step. Rex was moving in a wide circle now, his body low to the ground, occasionally pawing at the earth with his front paw in a gesture Sarah had seen 1,000 times during training. It was his indication behavior. It meant he'd detected something explosive. Sarah's blood went cold. "Nobody move," she said, keeping her voice as calm as possible, despite the fact that her heart was now trying to beat its way out of her chest. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't take another step." The mother started to cry, quiet sobs that she tried to muffle against the infant's head. Amira didn't react at all, still standing with that strange, listening posture, her bandaged arm hanging limp at her side. Sarah keyed her radio again. "This is Captain Mercer. I need EOD at my location immediately. Possible IED situation. Civilians in the danger zone. I repeat, civilians in the danger zone." The response came back crackling with static and urgency, but Sarah was barely listening. Her entire focus had narrowed to Rex and the ground around the family and the terrible mathematics of explosive devices. Blast radius, trigger mechanisms, pressure plates, tripwires, all the ways humans had invented to turn ordinary Earth into instruments of indiscriminate death. Rex completed his circle and sat down 20 meters from the family, his eyes locked on Sarah. The indication was clear. There was something here, something designed to kill, but the family had already walked into this space and nothing had detonated, which meant either the device hadn't been triggered yet, or the trigger was more sophisticated than a simple pressure plate, maybe a remote detonation, maybe a timer, maybe something even worse, a secondary device designed to kill the rescuers who came to help the initial victims. Sarah's mind was racing through scenarios, each one worse than the last. "How did you get here?" she called to the father, carefully modulating her voice to hide her fear. "Did someone direct you to take this path?" Fadi's voice came through her earpiece, translating her question. The father responded in rapid Arabic, gesturing back toward the village, then toward the road, his words tumbling over each other. Fadi translated. "He says a man stopped them. After they left the command post, a man in a uniform. He thought it was one of ours. The man said the main road to the medical station was closed due to the explosion. He told them to take this path instead. He was very insistent, very forceful." Sarah felt ice water flood her veins. What did this man look like? More rapid exchange. Then Fadi. He was wearing a balaclava, military gear. The father assumed he was coalition forces, but now he's not sure. The man's accent was wrong, and his eyes... Fadi paused. The father says his eyes were wrong. Sarah's hand tightened on her weapon. This wasn't random. The explosion on the western side of the village had been a diversion, and this family, this wounded little girl and her desperate parents, had been herded like animals into a killing zone. The question was why? And the answer, when it came, was going to be even worse than the question. Thayosindiri Samwag, the EOD team, arrived within 12 minutes, which felt like 12 hours. Staff Sergeant Chen was ex-Navy, rail-thin and permanently calm, with the kind of serenity that came from spending years defusing bombs and accepting that any day could be your last. He took one look at the situation, and his expression didn't change at all, which somehow made Sarah feel both better and worse at the same time. "Rex indicated in a full circle?" Chen asked, pulling on his protective suit with practiced efficiency. "Affirmative. Multiple points around the family's position. So we're not talking about a single device, we're talking about a field." Chen's voice was muffled by his helmet, but still perfectly clear. "Someone wanted to make sure whoever walked through here didn't walk back out." Sarah watched him approach the area, with the slow, careful movements of someone who understood that every step could be his last. He carried a portable detector, sweeping it in careful arcs, mapping the invisible landscape of death that lay hidden beneath the ordinary dirt. Behind her, Rex was whining, not the warning sound from before, but something different, something that sounded almost like grief. "Easy, boy," Sarah murmured, though she felt the same way. They'd been so close to letting this family continue on their way. If she hadn't run after Rex, if she'd sent him back, if she'd followed protocol instead of intuition, they would have kept walking. And then, she couldn't finish the thought. Chen was speaking into his own radio, calling out coordinates, describing what his equipment was detecting. Sarah couldn't hear all of it, but she caught enough. Multiple units, daisy chain configuration, anti-tamper features. This is sophisticated work. The family stood absolutely still. Amira's mother had her eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. The father's hand was on his daughter's shoulder, holding her steady, and Amira herself was looking at Rex with that same strange, distant expression, as if she were seeing something no one else could perceive. "Captain Mercer," Chen's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." "I'm listening. The good news is I've mapped the field. I know where the devices are. The bad news is they're positioned in a pattern that suggests the trigger isn't just pressure or proximity. Someone set this up with a remote detonator, which means someone is watching, and they can blow this entire area whenever they choose." Sarah's mouth went dry. "How do we get them out?" "There's a safe corridor. It's narrow, maybe 1/2 meter wide, and it's going to require them to move in single file with perfect precision. One wrong step and—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. "Can you guide them?" "I can try, but there's a problem." Chen turned to look at her, his face visible through the helmet's visor. "The little girl, the one with the injured arm. She's not going to have the strength or coordination to make this walk on her own. Someone's going to need to carry her. And that someone is going to need to weigh their steps perfectly, because any deviation from the path I'm about to mark is going to trigger a blast that will kill everyone in the immediate vicinity." Sarah's mind was already moving, calculating. "I'll do it. Captain, I'm going in. Mark the path. I'll carry the girl." Chen looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Understood. Give me 10 minutes to set up visual markers." Those 10 minutes felt like diving underwater and waiting to see how long you could hold your breath before your lungs caught fire. Sarah stood at the edge of the killing zone, watching Chen place tiny fluorescent flags every few meters, creating a trail that looked impossibly thin and fragile against the vast expanse of earth that surrounded it. Rex hadn't moved. He was still sitting, still watching, still waiting. Sarah knelt beside him, running her hand down his back. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew this was here before any of us did. How did you know, boy?" Rex turned his head and pressed his nose against her cheek, a gesture of affection he rarely showed on duty. And in that moment, Sarah understood something fundamental about the animal at her side. He hadn't been trained to detect this specific kind of danger. This wasn't explosives recognition or threat assessment. This was something deeper, something that bypassed all the careful conditioning and went straight to instinct. He'd smelled fear on the family. He'd seen the wrongness of their trajectory. He'd known that the explosion in the west was a lie, and the real danger was here, in this place that looked like every other stretch of worthless earth in this valley. Dogs knew things humans had forgotten how to sense, and Rex had just saved 4 lives, if Sarah could get them out. Theostindius Chen finished placing the markers and returned to the edge of the field, pulling off his helmet. His face was slick with sweat despite the relatively cool temperature. "The path is marked. I need the adults to go first. Mother with the infant, then the father. They walk heel to toe, keeping their weight balanced, staying within 20 centimeters of the flags. No sudden movements. No panic. If they freeze in place until I tell them to move, understood?" Sarah nodded, then keyed her radio. "Fadi, I need you to translate exactly what I'm about to say, word for word. This is life or death. Are you ready?" "Ready." Sarah laid out the instructions with brutal clarity, watching through her scope as Fadi relayed them to the family. The mother's face crumpled, but she nodded, adjusting her grip on the infant. The father's jaw was clenched so tightly, Sarah thought she could hear his teeth grinding even from this distance. "What about the girl?" Fadi asked. "Tell them I'm coming for her." Sarah didn't wait for arguments or permission. She pulled off her tactical vest, too bulky, too heavy it would throw off her center of gravity, and checked her weapon one final time before handing it to Chen. "If whoever triggered this watches me walk in there, they might decide to blow it early," she said quietly. "If that happens, you get everyone else as far away as possible. Don't wait, don't hesitate, just run." Chen's face was expressionless. "Noted." Sarah started down the corridor of flags. Each step was an exercise in perfect control. Weight shifted gradually, foot placed with absolute precision, balance maintained through core strength alone. She'd done similar drills during training, walking across narrow beams and rope bridges. But those had been exercises. This was reality, and reality had teeth. The family was 40 meters ahead. The mother went first, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd spent years carrying water jugs on her head, her body finding its center effortlessly despite the crying infant in her arms. The father followed, less graceful but no less determined, his eyes fixed on his wife's back as if he could will her to safety through concentration alone. And Amira stood at the center of the killing zone, waiting. Sarah was halfway to her when the ground shook. Not an explosion, not yet, but something else. A vehicle, maybe, approaching fast. The vibration traveled up through Sarah's legs, throwing off her carefully maintained balance for just a fraction of a second. She caught herself, froze, waited for the earth to settle. Behind her, Chen's voice came through sharp and urgent. "Captain, we've got movement. 2 vehicles approaching from the north. They're not broadcasting IFF signals. I repeat, unknown vehicles approaching your position." Sarah's heart rate spiked, but she forced herself to remain still, to breathe, to think. Unknown vehicles near an IED field was never, ever good news. It meant either the people who set this trap were returning to watch their work, or someone was about to stumble into the middle of a nightmare. "Can you intercept?" "Negative, they're too close. ETA 90 seconds. 90 seconds to reach Amira, pick her up, and walk back out along a path that required perfect precision and absolute calm." Sarah started moving faster, abandoning caution for speed, trusting muscle memory and luck in equal measure. The flags blurred past. Amira grew larger in her vision. 20 meters, 15, 10. The little girl was looking at her now, really looking, and her eyes were full of something Sarah couldn't name. Not fear, not hope. Something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Sarah reached her and dropped into a crouch. "I'm going to pick you up now," she said, even though the girl couldn't understand English. "Hold very still." Amira raised her arms, her injured one moving stiffly but without hesitation. Sarah slid her hands under the girl's weight. So light, God, she was so light. And lifted her in one smooth motion, settling her against her hip, adjusting her grip to keep her balance centered. The girl's arms wrapped around Sarah's neck. And that's when Amira whispered something directly into Sarah's ear. The words were in English, heavily accented but perfectly clear. "The man, he's coming back. He wants to see us die." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. There was no time to process what Amira had just said. No time to ask how the girl knew English when her parents apparently didn't, or what she meant by "wants to see us die," or anything else that mattered. There was only the path, the flags, the sound of engines getting closer, and the terrible weight of responsibility pressed against Sarah's chest, where Amira's small body rested. She started walking back. Each step was harder now with the additional weight. Her center of gravity shifted, her muscles working overtime to maintain perfect balance. Amira was absolutely still, not even breathing hard, her face pressed against Sarah's shoulder. The girl's injured arm was dripping fresh blood. The wound had reopened during the movement, and Sarah could feel the warmth of it soaking through her uniform shirt. Behind her, the vehicles were getting closer. She could hear them now, engines roaring, tires chewing up dirt road. "Chen," she said into her throat mic, her voice barely above a whisper because speaking required breath and breath required movement, and movement was dangerous. "Status on those vehicles. 30 seconds out, Captain, they're going to see you if they're hostile." I know. She knew. If whoever had set this trap was in those vehicles, if they had the remote detonator, if they decided Sarah carrying the girl out represented a failure of their plan, They could push a button and erase everyone in this field from existence. But there was nothing to do except keep walking. The mother and father had made it out. Sarah could see them at the edge of the safe zone, Chen positioning them behind the blast barriers the EOD team had erected. The mother was looking back, her hand over her mouth, her entire body shaking. The father had his arm around her, but his eyes were locked on his daughter, on the small figure being carried through a landscape of invisible death. 15 meters to safety. The vehicles crested the rise. Sarah didn't look. Looking meant turning her head, meant shifting her weight, meant dying. She kept her eyes on the flags, on her feet, on the microscopic strip of earth that represented the difference between life and whatever came after. 10 meters, the engines cut off, doors opening, voices shouting in Arabic, urgent and commanding. 5 meters. Chen's voice. "Captain, they've got weapons, RPGs, they're—" An explosion of sound, not explosives but gunfire, automatic weapons fire, sustained bursts, the particular staccato rhythm of AK pattern rifles. Sarah's entire body wanted to run, every instinct screaming at her to move faster, but she forced herself to maintain the same careful pace, same balanced steps, because fast meant dead, and careful meant maybe, possibly, if luck hadn't completely abandoned her, alive. 3 meters, more gunfire. Return fire now from Chen's team, the distinctive sound of M4s on full auto. Someone was screaming. Someone else was shouting coordinates. The radio was chaos. 1 meter. Chen's hands reached out, grabbing Sarah's arm, pulling her and Amira behind the blast barrier, just as something massive and terrible happened behind them. The world turned into light and noise. The IED field detonated in a rolling sequence of explosions, each device triggering the next, in a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. The ground heaved. The air became heat and pressure and flying debris. Sarah threw herself over Amira, covering the girl's body with her own, feeling the blast waves slam into the barrier and wash over them like a physical thing. When the world stopped shaking, and the ringing in her ears faded enough to hear again, Sarah lifted her head. The path they'd just walked was gone. Not just destroyed, but erased, turned into a crater landscape of churned earth and smoke. If they'd been 10 seconds slower, if she'd hesitated even once, if Rex hadn't known. "The vehicles," she managed to say. "The hostiles." Chen's face was grim. Dead. All of them. They were standing right at the edge of the field when someone triggered the charges. Maybe they planned to detonate remotely and didn't realize they were in the blast radius. Maybe they were arguing about whether to wait. Doesn't matter now. Sarah looked down at Amira, still sheltered in her arms. The girl was looking back at her with those enormous dark eyes, and there was something in them that looked like relief, mixed with a grief too old for her face. "You knew," Sarah whispered. "You knew they were coming. How did you know?" Amira's small hand reached up and touched Sarah's cheek, gentle as a butterfly landing. And then she said something that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. "Because the man with the wrong eyes was my uncle." And someone's arc of the aftermath unfolded in layers. First came the immediate tactical response, securing the area, treating wounds, accounting for personnel. The mother and father were rushed to the medical station with the infant, who had somehow slept through the entire ordeal. Amira's wound was cleaned and properly dressed by a Navy medic who kept shaking his head at how close to sepsis the girl had been. Then came the investigation. Military intelligence descended on the site within hours, sifting through the debris from the explosion, examining the bodies of the men in the vehicles, piecing together a story that was simultaneously more and less terrible than Sarah had imagined. The man Amira called her uncle, his actual name was Hassan al-Nouri, had been a low-level operative for a militant group that had been targeting coalition forces and local collaborators with increasing sophistication. The family's visit to the command post had been observed. Amira's injury had been seen as an opportunity. If a child wounded by foreign military equipment died on the way to a coalition medical facility, the propaganda value would be immense, so Hassan had set a trap. The explosion on the western side of the village had been designed to draw away response teams and create chaos. The IED field had been laid in the night, carefully positioned along the route he would redirect the family to take. He'd worn a coalition uniform stolen during a raid weeks earlier. He'd spoken with enough authority that desperate parents would trust him, and he'd planned to watch from a safe distance as the devices detonated, filming the whole thing to use in recruitment videos. But he hadn't accounted for Rex. The dog had smelled the fear on the family when Hassan redirected them, had sensed something wrong in the entire scenario. Maybe it was pheromones. Maybe it was body language too subtle for human eyes. Maybe it was something science hadn't figured out how to measure yet. But Rex had known, and he'd acted, and everyone was alive because of it. Except Hassan and the 3 men with him, who'd gotten too close to their own trap, probably arguing about whether to trigger it with Sarah still in the blast radius, and had been consumed by their own design. The investigation uncovered something else too. Amira's injury hadn't been an accident. Hassan had placed the piece of metal, a sharpened fragment of old ordnance, where he knew the girl would find it. He'd watched her pick it up. He'd let the wound fester for 2 days, refusing to let the family seek treatment, telling them the coalition forces would arrest them as suspected militants if they approached the command post. He'd manufactured the entire situation from the beginning, using his own niece as bait. When Sarah learned this, she spent 20 minutes locked in a bathroom stall, shaking, unable to process how anyone could do something like that to a child, to their own blood. But eventually she pulled herself together, splashed cold water on her face and went to find Amira. Thirsty Iziki, the girl was in the medical ward, sitting up in a cot that was too big for her. Her arm properly bandaged now, an IV drip running antibiotics into her system. Her parents were beside her, the mother still clutching the infant, the father holding Amira's good hand as if he were afraid she might disappear. Sarah approached slowly, not wanting to intrude on the family's moment. But Amira saw her and her face lit up with something that might have been a smile, if smiles could exist in a place like this. "Captain Mercer," Fadi said, appearing at her elbow. "They want to thank you. They're trying to find the words, but—" "Tell them it wasn't me," Sarah said quietly. "Tell them it was Rex." As if summoned by his name, the dog padded into the ward, moving directly to Amira's bedside. The girl reached down with her good hand, and Rex pressed his head against her palm, his tail wagging slowly. Sarah watched them together, the wounded child and the dog who'd saved her, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for months, maybe years. "Fadi," she said, "ask her something for me. Ask her how she knew to speak English, how she knew what her uncle was planning." The translator spoke to Amira in Arabic. The girl responded, her voice soft and halting, pausing frequently as if searching for words. Her parents listened with growing shock, the mother's hand flying to her mouth. Fadi turned back to Sarah, his face pale. She says Hassan had been teaching her English in secret for months, telling her she needed to learn the language of the enemy. He would show her videos, propaganda videos of attacks, of soldiers, of violence. He was grooming her, Captain, trying to turn her into— he couldn't finish. Into what? A martyr. He was planning to use her for something bigger than this. The IED field was supposed to be a test run. He wanted footage of coalition forces killing a child, even accidentally, that he could use to radicalize her further, to make her willing to carry out an attack herself. Sarah felt sick. But she didn't break, Fadi continued, and now his voice held a note of wonder. She learned the language, but she kept part of herself hidden. She watched for a chance to signal for help. And when she met Rex, he looked at the dog who was now lying beside Amira's cot. She says the dog had kind eyes, that she knew immediately he was good. So when Hassan tried to send her family into the trap, she decided to trust that if she could just get to the dog, somehow everything would be okay. Sarah knelt beside Rex, running her hand down his scarred, dusty coat. "You knew," she whispered again. "You knew she was trying to tell us something." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Sayasui Kazambachim, the official commendation, arrived 3 weeks later. Rex was awarded the Medal of Merit for Valor in Combat, a ceremony attended by local officials, military brass, and a small crowd of villagers who'd heard the story and wanted to see the hero for themselves. Someone had fashioned a tiny medal for Amira to pin on Rex's collar. She'd insisted on doing it herself, her injured arm still in a sling, but healing well. The photo of that moment, a small girl with enormous eyes pinning a medal on a dog, who sat with patient dignity, both of them surrounded by people who were alive because of a split-second decision to trust instinct over protocol, went viral across military social media. It became a symbol of something people needed to believe in, that goodness existed even in the darkest places, that courage could take unexpected forms, that sometimes the smallest acts of awareness could ripple outward and save not just lives, but entire futures. Because Amira's family wasn't the only story. The investigation into Hassan's network had led to the discovery of 3 other planned attacks, all of them targeting civilian populations, all of them designed to maximize casualties and create propaganda footage. The disruption of his cell had saved dozens, maybe hundreds of lives, and it all traced back to a dog who'd refused to ignore his instincts and a handler who'd trusted him enough to disobey orders. Sarah stayed in the village for another 4 months before her deployment ended. In that time, she watched Amira heal, not just physically but in deeper ways. The girl started attending school again, started playing with other children, started speaking more freely, her voice losing that haunted, distant quality and becoming something brighter. She also started visiting Rex every day. The dog would sit patiently, while Amira told him about her day in broken English, her vocabulary growing stronger with each passing week. Sometimes she would bring him treats she'd made herself, questionable combinations of ingredients that Rex ate with apparent enjoyment. Sometimes she would just sit beside him in silence, her small hand resting on his back, drawing comfort from his solid presence. And every time before she left, she would lean close to his ear and whisper something Sarah could never quite hear. On Sarah's last day in the village, she asked Amira what she whispered to Rex. The girl looked up at her with those eyes that had seen too much, but somehow retained their capacity for wonder. "I tell him thank you," she said simply. "I tell him he saved me, not just from the bombs, from becoming bad. He helped me remember how to trust good people." Sarah felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes and didn't try to stop them. "Rex is going home with me," she said gently, "back to America. But I promise you every single day I'll tell him you said thank you. I'll make sure he knows you're okay. Deal?" Amira nodded, then did something unexpected. She hugged Sarah, fierce and tight and desperate, as if trying to physically imprint the memory into both their bodies. When she pulled back, her face was wet with tears. "You saved me too," she whispered. "Both of you. You showed me heroes are real." Sarah knelt down to the girl's level one last time. "You saved yourself, Amira. You held on to who you were, even when someone was trying to turn you into something else. That takes more courage than anything I did. You're the real hero in this story." The girl smiled, a real smile this time, full and genuine, the kind that transforms a face and makes you remember that children are supposed to smile, are supposed to carry light instead of grief. "Maybe we all heroes," she said. "Different kinds." The flight home was long and uncomfortable. Rex restless in his travel crate, Sarah unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She kept thinking about the moment in that medical ward, about Amira's words, about the terrible mathematics of violence that said one person's hatred could set in motion a chain of events that could destroy dozens of lives. But also about how one dog's instinct could break that chain, how one person's decision to trust that instinct could save not just bodies but souls. When they finally landed at Dover Air Force Base, Sarah walked out into humid Delaware summer air and felt American soil under her boots and wanted to lie down right there on the tarmac and weep with relief. But she had Rex to care for, paperwork to file, debriefings to attend. So she kept moving. The military wanted to retire Rex. He was getting older, had served with distinction, deserved a peaceful life after everything he'd done. Sarah applied to adopt him before the official retirement papers were even filed. The approval came through in record time, probably because her commanding officer attached a note that read simply, "If you separate this dog from this handler, I will personally ensure your next assignment is counting penguins in Antarctica." Rex officially became hers on a Thursday in September. They drove to Sarah's apartment, a small civilian space she'd maintained throughout her service, barely lived in, but paid for, because it represented the idea of home. She opened the door and let Rex explore, watching him move through the rooms with careful precision, cataloguing scents and spaces, eventually settling on a spot by the window where afternoon sun pooled on the hardwood floor. He looked at her and she looked back, and something passed between them that had no need for words. They'd made it out, together, against odds that should have killed them both multiple times over. That night, Sarah sat on her couch with a beer she barely tasted and wrote an email to the family she'd saved. Fadi had set up an account for them, helped them navigate the basics of internet access. She didn't know if they'd respond, didn't know if they even wanted to hear from her. But she wrote anyway, telling them about Rex's retirement, about the medal ceremony, about the 3 other attacks that had been prevented because of what happened that day, telling them about the commendations and the debriefings and the endless questions from people who wanted to understand how a dog could sense danger that sophisticated equipment missed, and telling them that Amira's words, "We all heroes, different kinds," had stayed with her through everything that followed. The response came 3 days later. It was short, translated probably through multiple layers of language software, the grammar awkward, but the meaning luminous. "Dear Captain Mercer and Rex, we think of you every day. Amira is doing well. She starts new school next month. She wants to study medicine. She says she wants to help people the way you helped her. We tell everyone your story, about the brave dog and the brave soldier who listened to him. Many people here now understand that not all foreign soldiers are enemies, that some came to help, that some sacrificed to keep us safe. This is maybe small thing, but in place of much hate, small thing matters. We pray for you. We hope life is peaceful now. You deserve peace. With gratitude forever, the Al-Rashid family." Sarah read it 3 times, then saved it to a folder she labeled Things Worth Remembering. A year passed. Then 2. Sarah left the military, taking a civilian position training working dogs for search and rescue operations. Rex, theoretically retired, insisted on attending every training session, his presence teaching younger dogs things that formal instruction couldn't convey: patience, focus, the ability to read human emotions and respond with appropriate action. Sarah gave talks at schools and community centers about her experiences, about the importance of trusting your instincts, about how courage sometimes meant being willing to be wrong if it meant maybe being right about something that mattered. She never mentioned Amira by name, respecting the family's privacy, but she told the story of a little girl who'd held on to her humanity in impossible circumstances. And every year on the anniversary of that day, Sarah and Rex would drive to a quiet park, and she would let him run through grass that wasn't hiding explosives, under trees that weren't concealing snipers, beneath a sky that belonged to everyone and no one. On the 5th anniversary, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She opened it to find a photo of Amira, now 12 years old, taller and stronger, but with those same enormous eyes. She was standing in front of a building, wearing a school uniform, holding up a certificate of some kind. The message below read, "Top of my class medical training program. Because I want to save lives like Rex and Captain Mercer. Tell Rex I say thank you every day still. Tell him he changed everything." Sarah showed the photo to Rex, who lifted his head from his paws and studied it with that particular intensity he reserved for things he somehow recognized as important. "You hear that, old man?" Sarah whispered, her throat tight. "You changed everything." The dog's tail thumped twice against the ground, and Sarah understood in that moment the fundamental truth that people spent entire lives trying to articulate. That one act of attention, one moment of refusing to ignore what you knew to be true, even when you couldn't explain how you knew it, could ripple forward through time in ways you might never fully comprehend. Carson had tried to create a weapon out of a child. Rex had helped create a healer instead. The math was simple and impossible, and everything that mattered. You might never face a moment like the one Sarah faced in that dusty village. You might never walk through a field of invisible death, carrying someone who needs you to be perfect, when perfection feels impossible. But you will face moments when your instincts tell you something is wrong, even when logic says everything is fine. When someone needs help they haven't asked for because they don't know how to ask, or because they've been taught that asking is weakness. You will face moments when doing the right thing requires you to break the rules, to trust something deeper than training, to believe in the validity of intuition even when you can't prove it with data. And in those moments you'll have a choice. You can ignore what you know to be true, can follow protocol and procedure and the safe path that won't get you in trouble. You can let someone else handle it, can assume that if something were really wrong, surely someone else would notice, someone with more authority or training or responsibility. Or you can be like Rex. You can refuse to ignore what your instincts are screaming at you. You can act on incomplete information, because waiting for complete information means it will be too late. You can trust that the discomfort you feel in the presence of wrongness is real and valid, and worthy of response. You can be the person who runs toward danger, instead of away from it, not because you're fearless, but because someone needs you to be brave on their behalf. Amira needed Rex to be extraordinary that day, but Rex wasn't trying to be extraordinary. He was just being exactly what he was, a creature whose instincts hadn't been dulled by cynicism or protocol, whose capacity to sense danger and respond with protective action remained intact despite everything he'd been through. He was himself fully and completely, in a moment when being himself meant being heroic. That's what we all have access to, if we can stay present enough to our own knowing, if we can resist the pressure to dismiss our intuitions as paranoia or overreaction, if we can remain connected to that part of ourselves that knows things before we can articulate how we know them. The world tells us to be reasonable, to wait for evidence, to not make a fuss. But sometimes making a fuss saves lives. Sometimes being unreasonable in the face of danger is the most reasonable thing you can do. Sometimes the hero the situation needs is just someone willing to pay attention and act on what they notice, even when, especially when, everyone else is looking the other way. Rex didn't ask for permission to disobey orders. He didn't wait for confirmation that his instincts were correct. He ran toward a family in danger, because running toward danger was what he did, what he was built for, what his entire being understood as right and necessary. Sarah didn't dismiss him as disobedient or confused. She trusted him over protocol, over procedure, over the very reasonable assumption that multiple explosions meant you should run toward them, not away. She trusted the bond between them more than she trusted rules, and that trust created the space for heroism to emerge. And Amira, wounded, manipulated, groomed for violence, held onto a thread of hope thin enough to be invisible, waiting for a moment when she could grab it and pull herself toward safety. She saw kindness in a dog's eyes and chose to believe in it, chose to trust it, chose to bet her life on it. 3 beings, 3 acts of trust, 3 decisions to believe in something good when everything around them suggested they should believe in nothing. That's how villages get saved, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through small acts of awareness compounded until they become unstoppable. You are not a military working dog. You probably don't have specialized training in explosives detection or tactical operations. You will likely never walk through a minefield or face down armed militants, but you have instincts. You have the ability to notice when something feels wrong. You have the capacity to act on that notice, to trust yourself enough to step outside the boundaries of normal behavior when normal behavior isn't adequate to the moment. And that might be enough. It might be exactly enough because somewhere right now someone needs you to pay attention. Someone needs you to trust what you're sensing even though you can't prove it. Someone needs you to be willing to look foolish or overly cautious or paranoid or weird, because being any of those things is infinitely better than ignoring danger and letting it consume someone who deserves better. You might not save a village, but you might save a person, and to that person you are the entire world. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. They don't always have medals or commendations or stories that go viral on social media. Sometimes they walk on 4 paws, moving toward danger with the kind of certainty that comes from trusting what they know to be true. Sometimes they carry wounded children through invisible fields of death, one careful step at a time, refusing to let fear override the fundamental commitment to protecting something vulnerable. Sometimes they're 7 years old with a bandaged arm, holding on to hope because a dog showed them that kindness still exists. You contain all of these possibilities within you, the awareness, the courage, the refusal to look away. All you have to do is trust yourself enough to act when the moment comes. The moment will come and you will be ready, because you already are.